Stop. Don't scroll any further. What you're about to learn will wipe the shine off the faces of your favorite idols forever. You've seen them draped in silk and diamonds, but behind the scenes, these 10 gods of Olympus were rotting in poverty, dying in rundown flophouses while the tax authorities froze their accounts. And the last story will leave you stunned. This actress was once called the most beautiful woman on the planet. She invented a technology you use every single day, yet she ended up stealing cheap food from supermarkets just to keep from starving. Watch until the end to find out how her balance dropped to 24 cents and why her body went unburied for years. The truth about the Dream Factory is filthier than any gutter. Like, subscribe to Hollywood Unmasked, and tell us in the comments, is fame worth that price? Let's begin. We open this parade of shattered legends with a man who embodied pure energy, raw talent, and that old-school Hollywood creed that the show must never stop. Sammy Davis Jr., a small giant with a thunderous voice and feet that seemed to possess a rhythm of their own. He was a cornerstone of the legendary Rat Pack, the only black performer allowed to trade jokes as an equal with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin at a time when segregation still had America by the throat. Sammy was everywhere. Magazine covers, leading film roles, the brightest stages in Las Vegas. He embraced presidents and romanced Hollywood's most unattainable blondes. It seemed he had cracked the code of success and secured a golden retirement in a lounge chair beside a private pool. But if we open his ledgers instead of his scrapbooks, we don't find a triumph. We find a long, quiet plunge into the abyss, a descent Sammy masked masterfully beneath an endless celebration of life. The cruel irony was that he became a prisoner of his own image as the grand, carefree spender, and in the end, that role cost him everything. Sammy adored luxury with a childlike, insatiable hunger. He had grown up poor, raised in the rough world of traveling vaudeville, and when millions began pouring in, he decided he deserved every toy in the store. His car collection rivaled a dealership. His jewelry was worth fortunes. His homes resembled palaces lifted from an Arabian tale and dropped into the Nevada desert. There was just one problem. Sammy had no idea how to handle money. Finances were abstract to him, something that should simply exist as long as he kept singing and dancing. He showered friends, acquaintances, even household staff with extravagant gifts, trying to purchase the love and validation he had missed as a child. But while he scattered bills with a flourish, a mountain of unpaid tax notices grew silently behind him. Sammy possessed a rare talent, the ability to ignore letters from the IRS for years, genuinely believing his star status granted him a kind of diplomatic immunity from financial obligations. Unfortunately for Sammy, tax agents were not impressed by tap dancing. By the early 1980s, his financial bubble burst with a deafening crack. His debt to the government ballooned to an astronomical $7 million, a crushing sum at the time, even for a superstar. His accounts were frozen, his property began to be auctioned off, the image of the eternal winner started to splinter. But surrender was never in his vocabulary. Instead of declaring bankruptcy and slipping quietly into retirement, Sammy flipped the switch into survival mode. He worked 3 times as hard, accepting any performance, any commercial, any questionable television appearance. It became a race against death in the most literal sense. When he was diagnosed with throat cancer, the ultimate sentence for a singer, he refused a surgery that might have cost him his voice, simply because he needed to keep performing to pay the interest on his debts. Imagine the tragedy. A man who once defined cool, now standing under the stage lights, barely breathing through the pain, forcing a smile while knowing every cent he earned would vanish into government coffers. His final years became an endless tour of survival. Sammy Davis Jr. was held hostage by his own legend.
He continued to wear expensive suits and heavy gold chains even when he couldn't afford a proper dinner. It was the greatest performance of his life, the illusion of wealth amid total financial ruin. He refused to let the world see him weak or broke. The bitter twist was that the man who entertained millions lived in private dread of every phone call from collectors. Even as illness confined him, his debts continued to swell. By the time he died in 1990, the government was still waiting for its millions. When little Sammy drew his last breath in his Beverly Hills home, a house that was no longer truly his net worth stood at negative $5.2 million. It was the final note in his financial symphony, leaving the world owing it a fortune. The ending of Sammy's story would be unbearably bleak if not for old loyalties. When it became clear that his widow did not have enough money to arrange a proper farewell for the great entertainer, Frank Sinatra stepped in. The chairman of the board, no saint himself, honored their friendship and paid for the funeral in full. Without that act of grace, Sammy Davis Jr. might have been buried on credit or in an anonymous grave for the bankrupt. Sammy's life is a brutal lesson. In Hollywood, success is measured not only in applause, but in the ability to pay your bills on time. He lived like a magnesium flare, brilliant, blinding, and gone in an instant, leaving behind a heap of ashes and unpaid receipts. His tap dance on the edge of the abyss was virtuoso, but in the end, the gravity of debt proved stronger than talent. He left us his unforgettable recordings, and a harsh reminder that beneath the gold plating of the Hollywood dream, there is often nothing more than rust.
Barbara Payton. If the story of Sammy Davis Jr. is a tragedy of financial recklessness, then the story of Barbara Payton is a full-blown horror thriller about how Hollywood can do more than bankrupt a person. It can devour them whole and leave nothing behind, not even bones. In the early 50s, Barbara was not just another pretty blonde drifting through studio lots. She was a sensation, a woman with a dangerous glint in her eyes and a body that made producers tremble with the scent of profit. They predicted she would inherit the throne that would later belong to Marilyn Monroe. A contract with Warner Bros., leading roles opposite the legendary James Cagney, staggering paychecks and limousines idling at her door. This was Barbara Payton's reality. But she had one fatal flaw. She neither knew how nor wished to play by the rules of the Dream Factory. While studio bosses tried to sculpt her into a chaste yet tantalizing starlet, Barbie methodically smashed the facade with drunken brawls, reckless affairs, and a pull towards self-destruction that bordered on madness. She was too alive, too feral for the sterile Hollywood of that era, and that ferocity would eventually drive her into the darkest alleyways of Los Angeles. Her downfall did not begin with empty bank accounts, but with the collapse of her reputation. In an industry where image was worth more than gold, Payton began collecting arrests for drunk driving and public fights. The loudest scandal erupted when two of her lovers, actors Tom Neal and Franchot Tone, engaged in a bloody knife fight on the lawn of her own home. Hollywood gasped, and the tabloids choked on their delight. For Barbara, it was the beginning of the end. Studios tore up contracts, and major producers quietly placed her on blacklists as uncontrollable and toxic. The money that once flowed like a river slowed to a trickle. Accustomed to champagne breakfasts and designer gowns, Barbara suddenly found herself unable to pay the rent on her mansion. Instead of trying to salvage her career, she plunged deeper into the bottle, drowning the realization that her moment had expired before it had ever truly begun. By the mid-1950s, nothing remained of her former glory. Barbara Payton, whose face had once adorned posters across the country, drifted from one cheap motel to another, leaving behind unpaid bills and empty bottles. She attempted a return to the screen, but the only offers came from bargain basement exploitation films that paid barely enough for another bottle of whiskey. In 1960, she was arrested for forging a check for a pitiful few dollars, a humiliating end for a woman who had once handled tens of thousands with a flick of her wrist. Worse was still to come.
When the money finally ran out and her drinking companions vanished, Barbara found herself on the very streets where her towering billboards had once loomed overhead. Only now she was not gazing down at passers-by. She stood beneath them, offering herself to strangers for the price of a cheap drink. It was not merely poverty, it was total ruin, and Hollywood watched with detached disgust. The cruel irony was that the Los Angeles police arrested her for prostitution and vagrancy just blocks from the studios where she had once reigned. Officers failed to recognize the bloated, broken woman as a former movie star. The dangerous spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by the dull haze of alcohol. She slept in filthy flop houses, on bus benches, and ate whatever she could scrape together from charity kitchens. In 1967, beaten and utterly shattered, she was found on the street and sent back to her parents. By then, she was no longer Barbara Payton, but a shadow, a shell of a body ravaged by years of alcohol and drugs. She died at 39, an age when many actresses are only just entering their prime. Her ending was as quiet and colorless as her final years. Not a cent remained in her bank account, not a single valuable possession beyond yellowed newspaper clippings of past triumphs. Her few relatives she had left had to scrape together money for her funeral. Everything she had once earned had long since been drunk away or scattered to the wind. Her body was cremated, her ashes buried without ceremony. Hollywood, which had once promised her the world, barely noticed her passing. The story of Barbara Payton is a brutal reminder that the road from the red carpet to the gutter is far shorter than it seems, especially if you dare to defy a system that forgives nothing. She burned too fast, transforming from a blazing star into a handful of ash the winds of oblivion scattered over the hills of Beverly Hills.
Judy Garland. If Barbara Payton's story was a voluntary fall into the abyss, then Judy Garland's fate was a cold-blooded execution carried out by the Dream Factory itself. Judy was the prized cash cow of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the golden child whose throat poured diamonds in the form of flawless notes. We all remember her as Dorothy, the innocent girl in a gingham dress singing about a world somewhere over the rainbow. But few stop to consider that she paid for that single frame with every drop of her blood. Over the course of her staggering career, Garland earned around $40 million, a sum that in those days should have made her wealthier than a small European nation. But Hollywood never simply gave money, it took souls in return. From childhood, studio executives, including the tyrannical Louis B. Mayer, fed her pep pills to keep her filming 20 hours a day and sleeping pills to force her into 4 restless hours of unconsciousness. By the time she reached adulthood, Judy was not only a global star, but a deeply fractured human being, chained to lifelong chemical dependency and staring at an empty bank account. While she sang about happiness, her husbands, agents, and assorted hangers-on squandered her fortune faster than she could take a curtain call. Garland's tragedy was simple and devastating. She was a genius in art and catastrophically helpless in life. She had grown accustomed to others deciding everything for her, what she ate, whom she loved, how much she weighed. When the studio finally cast her out, labeling her too unstable and too expensive to insure, Judy discovered she was not just alone, she was broke. Her finances were a sieve. By the early 1960s, the greatest star in Hollywood had become a hunted creature running from hotel bills. She lived out of suitcases, slipping from room to room under cover of darkness to avoid paying what she owed. The enormous paychecks of her prime were replaced by small loans from sympathetic friends. Her wardrobe consisted of worn stage costumes that had long since lost their sparkle. The irony was merciless. The woman whose voice had comforted a nation during wartime now struggled for a piece of bread and a roof over her head. Her final years became a humiliating endurance tour.
Garland performed in third-rate cabarets and smoke-filled clubs for paltry sums just to keep collectors from pounding on the door of whatever temporary flat she occupied that month. She took the stage half fainting, fueled by pills and alcohol, because her fear of poverty outweighed even her fear of death. She was quite literally selling the last fragments of her talent to cover a fraction of the debts accumulated over decades of exploitation by those around her. The IRS followed her like a shadow, issuing bills she had no realistic way to pay. It was Hollywood cruelty at its most refined, allowing an icon to sink so low that she had to beg nightclub owners for advances. When Judy Garland died in London at 47, the world gasped, but the true shock came in the numbers revealed after her death. Her personal estate, built from decades of punishing labor, was valued at just $40,000. At the same time, her debt to the government stood at an astonishing $4 million. Judy Garland gave the world its rainbow, but she ended her life in a gray haze of poverty and despair. She was the embodiment of the American dream, which, upon closer inspection, proved to be a nightmare wrapped in silk and stitched with sequins. Her death in the bathroom of a rented apartment was an ending no MGM script would have dared to write, because it was too real, too raw. The yellow brick road led her not to the Emerald City, but to an empty bank account and a shattered heart. She died possessing nothing but fame, and fame cannot be traded for peace or bread. Hollywood devoured her childhood, drained her youth, and spat out her body, leaving behind only the echo of her songs and a mountain of unpaid bills. That was the price she paid to become a legend. And even for the greatest of the great, it was a price too high.
Veronica Lake. If there was a woman in the 1940s whose face defined an era as unmistakably as a military uniform or a burst of jazz, it was Veronica Lake. Her famous peekaboo hairstyle, a cascade of platinum hair veiling one eye in deliberate mystery, became a national obsession. Every other American woman seemed determined to copy it, even as factory workers risked their eyesight at industrial machines, until the government urged the actress to change her look for the safety of women working on the home front. Veronica was living gold for Paramount Pictures, a femme fatale whose icy gaze and smoky voice made men freeze in their theater seats. Yet behind the flawless facade lurked a temperament Hollywood privately called a curse. Veronica Lake was sharp-tongued, unyielding, and utterly incapable of biting her tongue when studio etiquette demanded submission. Her alcoholism, which began as an attempt to quiet the symptoms of emerging schizophrenia, quickly transformed her from golden girl into chronic liability. The studios that had fought for the right to cast her in their noirs soon grew weary of halted productions, public scandals, and her perpetual dissatisfaction. By the early 1950s, her contract was terminated, and the cult-like adoration that had once lifted her high shattered against the hard rocks of reality. Her fall was swift and merciless. In 1951, only a few years after standing at the pinnacle of fame, Lake declared bankruptcy. The lavish life of furs and diamonds gave way to endless lawsuits and mounting debts. She tried her hand at theater, experimented with television, but Hollywood has a famously short memory. If you no longer generate profit and instead generate problems, you are erased faster than a flawed take on set. Veronica slipped off the radar, and society pages promptly found a newer face to celebrate. The bitterest irony awaited her in the 1960s. A reporter stumbled upon the former screen goddess in New York, and what was the woman whose face had once been known across the nation doing? She was working as a cocktail waitress at the bar of the Martha Washington Hotel. Imagine the surreal scene. You order a martini, and a tired, middle-aged woman with weary eyes delivers it, and you have no idea that she is the same Veronica Lake whose posters once dominated city skylines.
She lived in a tiny rented room, ate in inexpensive diners, and survived on meager tips from patrons who never suspected who stood before them. Veronica tried to preserve her dignity, telling interviewers that waitressing gave her a sense of reality she had lacked in Hollywood. But beneath the brave words lay the deeper tragedy of a woman used and discarded by the industry that once worshipped her. Her wages barely covered rent, and her constant companion, the bottle. She was alone. Her relationships with her children were fractured, and old friends from the film world had long since struck her name from their address books. When she died in 1973 of hepatitis and kidney failure at the age of 50, only a pitiful sum remained in her bank account, barely enough to support a modest week of living. Even death offered little peace. Because of legal complications and her children's lack of funds, her ashes remained unclaimed in a Vermont funeral home for years, forgotten and gathering dust. Only decades later did a small group of devoted fans raise the money to lay her to rest properly. It was a final, bitter twist of fate. A woman who had once been a style icon ended her journey in obscurity, leaving behind nothing but a curl of smoke and the fading echo of former glory, an echo no one had been willing to pay for.
Bela Lugosi. If there was ever an actor in Hollywood whose signature role did more than make him famous, whose role buried him alive in a coffin of repetition, it was Bela Lugosi. A Hungarian émigré with aristocratic poise and a heavy, hypnotic gaze, he arrived in America dreaming of grand, dramatic parts. Instead, he became Dracula, and that was both his greatest triumph and his death sentence. In 1931, audiences shuddered at his icy line, "I never drink wine," and overnight Lugosi became the most sought-after monster in the Dream Factory. But Hollywood is no castle in the Carpathians. Here, it isn't vampires who drain the blood, it's managers and studio executives. They quickly realized Lugosi was the perfect captive of a single image. While his rival Boris Karloff managed to shed the monster's mask and take on diverse roles, Bela remained a prisoner of his accent and his cape. His pride and his refusal to master English turned against him. Studios offered him either grotesque creatures in low-budget horror films or nothing at all. By the 1940s, his career resembled slow decay in an abandoned crypt. The lavish paychecks of his early fame dissolved into the fog of bad investments and a habit of living extravagantly, a habit he had cultivated during his theatrical glory days in Budapest. Bela Lugosi's tragedy was deepened by physical pain. Old back injuries led him to morphine and later methadone. In those days, Hollywood did not recognize the word rehabilitation. An addicted actor was not ill, he was defective merchandise. Bela became an outcast. Major studios closed their doors, wary of his unpredictability and the narcotic haze that enveloped him more and more often. His debts multiplied like bats at dusk. In 1955, the once magnificent Count Dracula was forced to declare bankruptcy. It was a humiliating spectacle. Official documents recorded that the man whose face had become synonymous with terror across the globe possessed just $1,900 in assets, while owing more than $3,500. His house was taken, his belongings were auctioned for pennies. He drifted through modest apartments furnished with little more than a bed and a trunk filled with old stage costumes. Bela Lugosi, aristocrat of the spirit, had become a destitute old man willing to take any job to afford painkillers and a bit of food. It was in this season of utter despair that fate paired him with Ed Wood, later dubbed the worst director of all time. To Wood, Lugosi was an idol. To Lugosi, Wood was a final lifeline. Their collaboration was at once touching and unbearably tragic.
The great actor performed amid cardboard sets in Plan 9 from outer space, delivering absurd lines surrounded by flying saucers fashioned from hubcaps. He carried himself with the same dignity he once brought to the stage of Hungary's National Theatre. Yet audiences no longer trembled, they laughed. It was the final blow to his pride. Bela became a monument to himself, a caricature of the Count trying to earn bread in a cheap carnival. When he died in a heart attack in 1956 at the age of 73, he lay in his worn pajamas, and his refrigerator contained nothing but emptiness. The ending of his story carries that peculiar Hollywood melancholy rarely mentioned in glossy brochures. It turned out his family did not have enough money to bury him with dignity. And once again, the figure of Frank Sinatra appears, a man who seemed to act as an unofficial guardian angel to the bankrupt stars of his era. Sinatra quietly covered the funeral expenses, sparing the horror legend, the shame of a pauper's grave. According to Lugosi's wishes, he was buried in his most famous costume, the black cape lined in crimson that had once conquered the world. Yet even here, fate allowed itself a final smirk. It was an old, mended theatrical garment, the only valuable possession creditors had not bothered to seize. Bela Lugosi entered eternity as Dracula because the real man named Bela had long since ceased to exist for Hollywood. He became dust, remembered by millions as an immortal vampire, a man who in life never managed to earn a quiet old age, free of debt and morphine.
Dorothy Dandridge. If beauty and talent were a currency that could be freely exchanged, Dorothy Dandridge should have owned half of Los Angeles. She was Hollywood's Black Pearl, a woman whose grace could silence the noisiest room and whose singing voice slipped straight into the soul. In 1954, she did the unthinkable. She became the first African-American woman nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Carmen Jones. It was a historic breakthrough, a moment when it seemed that racial barriers had finally buckled under the weight of her undeniable brilliance. But Hollywood in the 1950s was a place where, for a black actress, no matter how gifted, the ceiling was made of reinforced glass. After the nomination that should have crowned her queen, Dorothy discovered that the industry still saw her as little more than an exotic adornment or the inevitable tragic mulatto. She was offered maid roles, which she rejected with justified indignation, or second-rate projects unworthy of her stature. While her white counterparts signed contracts worth millions, Dorothy fought for every scrap of attention, gradually realizing that her historic success had been for studio executives little more than a polite gesture, an exception they had no intention of repeating. Dandridge's financial collapse was not the result of reckless spending or a taste for gambling. She was undone by the system and by a series of disastrous personal decisions. As a woman navigating a world run by men, she entrusted her finances to the wrong people. Husbands and managers treated her accounts as their own private wallets, pouring her earnings into dubious ventures that failed one after another. At the same time, her private life was marked by tragedy. Vast sums were spent on care for her daughter, who suffered from severe brain damage and developmental disabilities. Dorothy paid for the best clinics money could buy, hoping for a miracle that never came. In the end, her nightclub performances barely covered mounting medical bills. When offers from Hollywood finally dried up, thanks in part to her so-called difficult temperament, which in truth meant her refusal to play degrading stereotypes, she found herself in the grip of the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS showed no mercy to fallen icons. One by one, her possessions were seized, stripping away the last remnants of her former splendor. By 1963, the fall was official. Dorothy Dandridge declared bankruptcy. Her debts totaled $150,000, a figure that may seem modest today, but at the time, for an actress without steady work, it was a death sentence. Everything was taken, the luxurious furnishings, the jewelry, even the fragile illusion of security.
The woman who had once dazzled on red carpets and furs now lived quietly in a small rented apartment in West Hollywood, avoiding her neighbors' eyes. She tried to return to the stage, singing in modest venues where audiences were more interested in their drinks than in her voice, but her spirit had been battered. The racism of the industry, compounded by personal misfortune, turned her life into a relentless struggle for survival, with an ending that felt pre-written. She had become an outsider in a world she herself had helped transform, opening doors for generations to come, yet never reaching the promised land. The final chapter of Dorothy Dandridge's life is perhaps the most bitter statistic in Hollywood history. In September 1965, she was found dead in her apartment. The cause was an overdose of antidepressants. Whether accident or silent cry for help, the world never learned. She was only 42. When officials examined her accounts to determine what remained of the legacy of the first black woman ever nominated for an Oscar, they were stunned into silence. Dorothy had 24 cents in her bank account. Not a misprint, not an exaggeration. 24 cents. That was all that remained of the woman who had altered the course of film history. The cruel irony was that even her funeral had to be financed through donations and the generosity of a handful of loyal friends. The style icon did not have enough money left for a proper coffin. She died in obscurity and poverty, a casualty of a system that allowed her to dream but refused to pay what that dream was worth. Dorothy Dandridge was a comet streaking across the Hollywood sky, brilliant, unforgettable, and consumed by the dense atmosphere of prejudice and financial exploitation. Her story stands as a permanent indictment of the dream factory, so adept at creating myths and so incapable of protecting those who bring them to life. Today, her name appears in film textbooks and retrospectives, but those 24 cents remain an indelible reminder of how cheaply Hollywood once valued lives that did not fit its spotless standards. She cleared a path for women like Halle Berry and Viola Davis, paying the highest possible price for that road, her own life, which ended in a quiet apartment to the sound of a dripping faucet and the ringing silence of poverty.
Marie Prevost. If you still believe Hollywood is nothing but dazzling smiles and champagne splashing in swimming pools, Marie Prevost's story will shake that illusion to its core and strip the romance from the silent era forever. Marie was more than an actress. She was the embodiment of the Roaring Twenties, one of Max Sennett's famed bathing beauties, whose lively laughter and flashing legs helped America forget Prohibition and its troubles. The great Ernst Lubitsch called her his favorite. By the mid-1920s, her earnings allowed her to purchase mansions rivaling the estates of European royalty. She was a style icon, a woman whose face on a poster guaranteed box office success. But Hollywood is a predator that feeds on youth and novelty. For Marie Prevost, that predator arrived in the form of sound. When voices began echoing from the screen, her high, slightly shrill tone and noticeable accent clashed with the glamorous persona she had cultivated for years. Instead of adapting or refining her speech, Marie, sensitive, fragile by nature, chose the most accessible escape from reality: alcohol. Her career collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Studios that had sworn eternal loyalty abruptly tore up contracts. Admirers who once worshipped her barely recognized her as her face swelled from constant drinking. Marie's financial ruin was not merely the loss of money, it was the annihilation of her entire way of life. Lavish mansions were sold to cover debts. Her diamond collection vanished at auction to pay endless bar tabs and rent for furnished rooms. By the early 1930s, the Golden Girl had faded into a pale shadow inhabiting a shabby Hollywood apartment where peeling wallpaper mirrored the disintegration of her reality. She tried to secure bit parts, accepted humiliating roles, anything to remain visible. But her reputation as an unreliable alcoholic, someone who might derail a shoot at any moment, turned her into an outcast. Absolute loneliness closed in. Friends from high society evaporated along with her bank balance. The only creature that remained loyal was her small dachshund, Maxie. The irony was savage. The woman who once served caviar to entire parties could not always afford a simple can of food for herself.
February 1937 brought the final horrific chord of this tragedy, an episode that turned Marie Prevost's life into urban legend. Neighbors in her cheap apartment building began complaining about the relentless, anguished barking coming from her room. When police finally forced the door, they encountered a scene too grim even for a film noir. Marie had been dead for several days. She lay on her bed, emaciated, surrounded by empty bottles. But the most devastating detail was this. Her loyal dachshund, driven mad with hunger, had begun gnawing at her body in a desperate attempt to survive. The face once adored by millions was marred beyond recognition. In her handbag, officers found $300, all that remained of the millions she had earned during her years of glory. Hollywood had devoured Marie while she lived. Her dog finished the tragedy after she died. It was a brutal irony. A star who lived for adoring gazes ended her life unseen, reduced to sustenance in her own rented room. Her death sparked a brief flare of media attention, more morbid fascination than mourning. Newspapers lingered on the grotesque details, turning a human collapse into cheap sensation. Only a handful of people attended her funeral, those who remembered her not as a fallen drunk, but as a sparkling comedienne. Her story became shorthand for how swiftly Hollywood forgets its heroes the moment they stumble. Marie slipped into obscurity, leaving behind little more than a grim anecdote about a dachshund and an empty purse. She was a silent film icon, yet her ending was too loud, too brutal to ignore. She died at 38, a monument to Hollywood's indifference, colder than any ice cube clinking in a cocktail glass.
Bud Abbott. If you believe that the status of national hero and savior of the economy can shield you from the relentless machinery of American justice, the story of Bud Abbott will quickly cure you of that illusion. In the 1940s, the duo Abbott and Costello was not merely popular, it was a comedic force of nature that swept through radio, film, and the fledgling world of television. Abbott, the straight man of the pair, was the brain and backbone of their success. The money they earned was so staggering that even modern Hollywood stars might blush at the comparison. At the height of the Second World War, Bud and Lou Costello accomplished something extraordinary. They toured the country and raised $85 million in war bonds. It was a colossal sum, enough to finance entire fleets. They were patriots, idols, seemingly untouchable pieces on Hollywood's chessboard. But the government they supported so fervently proved to have a remarkably short memory. Once the guns fell silent and the public's appetite for their brand of comedy began to cool, men from the Internal Revenue Service appeared at Bud Abbott's door, carrying bills large enough to bankrupt a small republic. Abbott's problem was simple. He lived lavishly, convinced the river of gold would never run dry. Grand estates, household staff, collectible cars, and a habit of spending with reckless confidence, he wrote much of it off as business expenses. The IRS saw things differently. What followed was a long, grinding pursuit that stretched on for years. The agency disallowed most of his deductions and piled on penalties and interest until the total eclipsed his actual earnings. The situation worsened in 1959 when Lou Costello died. Without his other half, Abbott was professionally adrift. Studios had no use for a lone straight man. In what felt like a single cruel turn, he went from multi-millionaire to a man systematically stripped of everything he owned. The tax authorities seized his home, claimed his share of profits from past films, and emptied his savings. Bud Abbott, who once dined with moguls, moved into a small, shabby apartment furnished with bargain store remnants. The irony reached its peak in the early 1960s. The man who had raised millions for his country found himself unable to pay his own electricity bill. He tried to stage a comeback, experimented with forming a new partnership, but the moment had passed. Audiences wanted new faces, new rhythms. His own face, lined with age and financial strain, no longer summoned laughter as it once had. By 1964, the humiliation was complete. The former king of comedy went on television to make a direct appeal for financial help from his fans.
Imagine the scene: a Hollywood legend, an elderly man with a trembling voice, asking strangers to send a few dollars so he might simply live out his remaining years under a roof. It was the American dream unraveling in real time. Assistance arrived, but it barely covered immediate debts. Abbott spent his final years in constant dread of the next letter from the IRS, feeling betrayed by the country to which he had given his best years and millions of hard-earned dollars. When he died of cancer in 1974 at the age of 78, he left behind nothing. His assets had long since been confiscated or sold. The man whose laughter once lifted a nation out of despair died in poverty, leaving behind unpaid bills and the bitter truth that in Hollywood your worth is measured by your last check. His funeral was modest, almost discreet, so as not to attract creditors. Bud Abbott departed as a bankrupt, proving that even $85 million raised for the state would not purchase a shred of leniency from a tax inspector. He fell victim to his own trustfulness and financial naivety, but above all, to a system skilled at collecting and inept at gratitude. His fate stands as a warning to anyone who believes Hollywood success is permanent. He was half of a duo every child once knew by heart, and in the end, he faced an empty refrigerator and relentless collectors, alone. His laughter faded in the silence of a modest apartment, leaving behind black and white reels of film and an unspoken question. How could a country allow one of its heroes to fall so far? Comedy's white gold crumbled to dust under the weight of tax returns, and Bud Abbott, once a Robin Hood of laughter, ended his days stripped even of the right to a dignified old age.
Hedy Lamarr. The story of Hedy Lamarr may be Hollywood's most refined insult to human intelligence. In the 1940s, she was hailed as the most beautiful woman in the world, and that title became a gilded cage she never managed to escape. Hedy was not merely a breathtaking brunette with marble skin. She was a mind operating on frequencies far beyond those of most of her peers. At the height of the Second World War, while her colleagues at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer posed for pin-up posters, Hedy was working alongside composer George Antel on a frequency-hopping communication system designed to prevent Allied torpedoes from being jammed. That invention would one day underpin Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. Yet when Lamarr presented her designs to the National Inventors Council, she was patronizingly advised to use her face to sell war bonds instead of her brain to design weapons. Hollywood did not want a female scientist. It wanted an exotic image, a silent goddess who would generate profit until the first wrinkles appeared. She complied, but that surrender set in motion the slow machinery of her ruin. Lamarr's financial collapse was shaped not only by 6 disastrous marriages, each divorce draining her fortune, but also by an industry incapable of valuing her beyond her appearance. She earned vast sums, yet the money slipped away through legal fees, poor investments, and desperate attempts to preserve the unearthly beauty the market demanded. When her film career faded, Hedy discovered she possessed little beyond patents the U.S. government had quietly classified and used without paying her a cent in royalties. It was a form of sanctioned plunder. The nation benefited from her brilliance while she counted the last bills in her wallet. By the 1960s, the world's most beautiful woman had become a recluse, her bank account shrinking faster than her fame. Loneliness and financial strain pushed her toward strange and humiliating episodes the tabloids devoured, eroding what remained of her public image. The most shocking moments of her decline were her arrests for shoplifting. In 1966 and again in 1991, the woman once considered the standard of perfection was detained in discount stores in Los Angeles and Florida for attempting to take inexpensive cosmetics and medication. The world laughed at the spectacle of a fallen star, unaware it was the cry of someone who had given the future its wireless language, yet struggled to maintain dignity in the present.
Her relationship with her own reflection turned bitter. She underwent plastic surgery after plastic surgery, trying to reclaim the face that had once sustained her, until she transformed herself into a mask she preferred not to show. In her final years, Hedy Lamarr lived quietly in Florida, communicating with the outside world mostly by telephone. She died in 2000 at the age of 85, largely forgotten by the industry that had profited from her for decades. The cruelest irony is that recognition came when it no longer mattered. Only late in her life did the scientific community begin to acknowledge the importance of her patent. It was too late to rewrite the financial reality of her past. She never received the material compensation one might expect for a technology now worth untold billions. Hollywood treated her beauty as a disposable asset and discarded her intellect as an inconvenience. She was too intelligent to be reduced to an actress, too beautiful to be taken seriously as an inventor. In the end, she was denied both identities. Hedy Lamarr left behind a world bound together by invisible threads of her innovation, yet she departed it in near isolation. We use wireless connections every day without realizing that the woman who helped make them possible once struggled to maintain her place in a world that had celebrated and then abandoned her. She was a screen goddess and a laboratory visionary, but in Hollywood's ledger she became a depreciated asset, no longer yielding dividends. She died without the justice she deserved, leaving us flickering images on film and signals in the air, technologies worth billions that could not secure her the simple comfort of an untroubled old age.
Errol Flynn. Let us end this descent into Hollywood's gutter with a figure so grand that his fall resembles the sinking of a transatlantic liner. Errol Flynn, a name synonymous with swagger, masculine charisma, and an endless celebration of life. In the 1930s and 40s, he was the golden boy of Warner Bros., the definitive Robin Hood, who not only robbed the rich on screen, but lived as if the world's gold reserves belonged solely to him. His fees were astronomical. His estate, Mulholland Farm, became the epicenter of some of California's most decadent parties, and his yacht, Sirocco, sliced through the oceans, stocked with champagne and young protégés. Flynn lived at 200 miles an hour, scorning any notion of planning for tomorrow. To him, money was nothing more than fuel for relentless hedonism. But Hollywood is a creditor with a short memory for past triumphs and a sharp memory for present debts. By the early 1950s, it became clear that the king of adventure had not merely squandered his millions, he owed nearly everyone, from the tax authorities to former wives and casino owners. Flynn's life turned into a prolonged hangover in which bailiffs lurked around corners instead of cheering crowds. His collapse began with an inability to separate his screen persona from reality. While he portrayed noble heroes, his private life became a battlefield. The notorious statutory rape trial, though it ended in acquittal, cost him dearly in reputation and legal fees. His appetites for women, alcohol, and gambling were insatiable, and his financial illiteracy was legendary, even by Hollywood standards. He entrusted his affairs to con men, signed documents without reading them, and spent money he had yet to earn. By the mid-1950s, Flynn found his account drained and his once flawless face, an emblem of masculine beauty, reduced to a weathered mask marked by excess and illness. Studios no longer trusted him with leading roles, fearing production delays caused by yet another drinking spree. The great swashbuckler was reduced to appearing in low-budget European films he privately dismissed as trash, taking whatever work he could simply to pay for liquor and seedy hotel rooms. The bitter irony of his final act was that Flynn clung to the image of the wealthy playboy while living on borrowed time and borrowed money.
He traveled the world in part to evade the U.S. tax authorities, who presented him with bills running into the millions. His once glorious yacht, Sirocco, became a floating prison, too expensive to maintain, yet too symbolic to surrender. In 1959, he arrived in Vancouver intending to sell the vessel and salvage what remained of his fortunes. Instead, he suffered a sudden heart attack. He was only 50, but the pathologist who performed the autopsy remarked that his body resembled that of a man at least 80 years old. He was a biological bankrupt, having spent his physical reserves as recklessly as his earnings. When lawyers untangled his estate, they discovered that from a once vast fortune, only about $10,000 remained, a sum that would have barely covered a few elegant dinners in the years when he reigned supreme. Errol Flynn died as he had lived, in debt, surrounded by dubious companions, with the taste of cheap wine on his lips. A Robin Hood stripped of even his final garments. His story stands as a bold full stop in the chronicle of Hollywood hypocrisy and financial ruin. Flynn proved that one can amass mountains of gold, become the idol of generations, and still end life like a vagabond in an expensive but threadbare suit. Hollywood drained him of his spark and vitality, discarding the shell once it ceased to shine. He left his children little but debts and scandalous memoirs, a living cautionary tale that every dazzling minute beneath Hollywood spotlights demands repayment at 100-fold cost. More often than not, that repayment arrives as total, humiliating poverty when the curtain falls and the theater goes dark.
Drawing the final line beneath this parade of shattered lives and empty bank accounts, we are forced to admit a bitter truth. The golden age of Hollywood was not only an era of elegance and glamour, but a time of profound financial and moral cannibalism. Behind the flawless smiles and blinding studio lights stood an industry that first placed people on pedestals, then coolly watched them shatter against the concrete of reality. The 10 stories we have traced are not isolated misfortunes. They are a systemic verdict on the dream factory itself. Hollywood in those years was a professional dealer of illusions, hooking its stars on luxury, fame, and a counterfeit sense of security, only to yank the rug out from under them at the perfect moment and present a bill no one could ever pay. These legends were virtuosos on screen, yet in the world of tax notices, predatory managers, and an unforgiving state apparatus, they were as defenseless as children. We watched millions shrink into cents, and mansions dissolve into peeling corners of rented rooms. We learned that in this particular casino, the house always wins. The bitter irony is that decades later, we still admire their films, rarely remembering that every frame of eternal greatness was purchased with poverty, loneliness, and humiliating oblivion. These icons did not die bankrupt because they lacked talent. They died bankrupt because, in Hollywood's accounting, a human life is a depreciating asset. When we look at the 24 cents left behind by Dorothy Dandridge or the worn cape of Bela Lugosi, the gilding flakes away completely, revealing the rusted machinery of an industry that knows no mercy. The golden age is gone, but it leaves us with a lesson. The glare of the spotlight is often only the prelude to darkness. And if anyone still dreams of a Hollywood fairy tale, let them remember, in this story, the carriage always turns back into a pumpkin, and the coachman inevitably becomes a tax collector. And for that transformation, the price is extracted to the very last breath.